Hello everybody and welcome to October's episode of the Queerness podcast. Last month we spoke to Miriam O'Brien and Ashley Jordan, an actress and dancer based in Coventry, but who have worked all around the world, in our podcast titled Queering Roles and Fighting Typecasts, where we discussed what it means to be queer or not queer in the creative industries. We looked at the intersections of race, gender and sexuality and how these all play a role in an industry notorious for a lack of diversity. I would encourage all of our listeners to go back and listen to the experiences of these two fantastic performers as they explore and discuss their position in the industry and within these intersections. This month, we are going for a Halloween-themed podcast with an exploration of queerness in the Australian horror film The Babadook. We speak to Jamie Sargent, who has years of experience in the film industry and is currently a screenwriter, and discuss how the Babadook became a queer icon and what does it really mean to look at horror in a queer way. With this month's podcast, are you ready to be Babashook?
Hello everyone and welcome back to our podcast for Queerness. It's nice to hear you back, or new if this is the first one you're listening to. My name is Nick. I am the co-convener of Queerness with Hannah Ayres, and we're a little research collective that focuses on queer topics and queer themes. Have a look at our website. It's got loads of information on there. It's absolutely amazing. I know it is. I made it. No, I didn't actually make it, but we made it and it's fabulous, and I'm allowed to say this. It's queerdisrupt.com. We are recording a podcast. I am currently in my flat and the gods have thanked me today by putting a rather large amount of building work underneath me taking place. So if you hear drills and everything in the background, I can do naught but apologise and hope for the best. With me, I have Jamie, who is a friend of mine. He is on one of our previous podcasts and I recommend you go back and listen to all four of them, aside from this one. And he is in the one called Queer Tunes. Jamie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jamie and I'm a writer and a technical specialist at Staffordshire University London, and I'm just a all-round film fan as well.
So I brought Jamie on because we had a conversation on our last podcast about queer themes in cartoons. So he was the obvious choice to come to when talking about queer themes in films generally. He is now my go-to film buff, as it was. I'm looking at Jamie right now and I wouldn't call him buff normally, so he's going to take film buff as and when he can, I think, because
I mean, you haven't seen me take off my shirt, so
hey, we'll save that for the OnlyFans. That is not making the podcast. We're here today to talk about the Babadook. I didn't quite introduce myself, I realised. Like I said, I'm Nick, I'm the co-convener. I'm a PhD student at Warwick Sociology Department, and I look at drag and queerness and media representations on the side, kind of, and how gender and queerness is constructed and deconstructed in films. So I actually find this quite an interesting topic, so I'm looking forward to talking about it. First things first, let's give a nice little rundown of the Babadook, because that is what we're talking about today in our Halloween theme. So Jamie being our film hunk, we're gonna move through various descriptions. I think our film hunk of the day. Could you give us a rundown of what the Babadook is about, please, Jamie?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that boost to my my self-confidence. Okay, so Babadook is a 2014 Australian indie horror movie written and directed by Jennifer Kent. It's starring Ezzie Davis as Amelia and Noah Wiseman as Samuel. So the plot of the film is Amelia, who lost her husband in a car crash on the way to give birth to Samuel, their only child, struggles to cope with her fate as a single mum. Samuel's constant fear of monsters and violent outbursts towards others contributes to their isolation from society. One night, they read a strange book in their house about the Babadook monster that hides in the dark areas of their house. Even Amelia seems to feel the effect of Babadook and desperately tries in vain to destroy the book. Is the Babadook real or a figment of Samuel and later Amelia's imagination, or is there something more happening?
Brilliant, thank you. It's an interesting film. It's worth having a watch, I think, for those of you that haven't seen it, particularly in light of this conversation. I would recommend giving it a watch. I guess first up, I think I'm just going to ask you, Jamie, up front, like, do you like the film just generally? Like, I can talk about my thoughts on it as well, but I'm curious to hear what you think.
Yeah, I went into this film thinking, because it's obviously had the hype and it's quite acclaimed, I went into the film thinking that it was probably be better than I thought it was. Yeah, I liked the film, but for me, there was certain choices within the film that didn't quite resonate with me. There was some acting choices which I felt were a little weird, and although it was very stylized, some of the choices that the director made, that Jennifer Kent made, I thought distracted from the overall story a little bit too much. But overall, it was an enjoyable film. I had a good time watching it, but I probably wouldn't revisit it.
Yeah, I think I'm probably on a similar sort of vibe in terms of my thoughts on the film as well. It was a really interesting idea. I think it's a fantastic idea. I'm not going to lie, actually. I think the execution wasn't necessarily amazing. I think part of that was because it was an indie film, it was independent, and I'd be kind of curious to see like if she had a bigger budget and like a more breadth of sort of, I guess, access and control, how it would have changed. But at the same time, I'm kind of skeptical that would have kept the actual feel that made it good when it is good.
Yeah, and I think it's quite telling in that it was originally a short film that was made into a feature-length film. So I think that maybe the premise was stretched out a little bit too far. There maybe should have been extra themes and things like that brought in. But, you know, it was a very tight film as well. It was only 90 minutes. So I think it didn't outstay its welcome.
Yeah, brilliant. Again, I agree with, I think, everything you're saying there. But with that, could you just introduce maybe like some of the themes that have come up with it? Could you talk about, what's the film about? I mean, I see a lot of people talking about it in relation to grief and sort of mental illness and so on. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely the main themes are around grief and around how that affects someone and the kind of mental state that you can kind of get into while trying to grieve. I think there's also themes about being an outsider and being cast off by society and people around you and family members. And I think those themes are probably less prevalent. I think it's very focused on the grief and the mental health implications of that grief. And I think because it's a horror movie, it has to play up to some of the tropes that come with horror movies. So I don't think it was looking to go that much further than what it was saying. It is primarily about trying to scare the audience to make them feel uncomfortable. And yeah, I think that again comes from the fact that it was a short film that was made longer. I think, you know, very simplistic themes, and that's not necessarily a bad thing either. I think sometimes films can go a little bit the other way and they tend to pack stuff in too much. So yeah, I think for me the main one is grief, but there are all these kind of side sub themes that kind of are woven throughout the film. Whether or not they get lost a little bit when the horror gets heightened is kind of up for debate, I think.
No, I agree. I think there's a lot there. I think the main focus is grief. And as you said, I think there's a lot of other interwoven through topics that sort of play through that. I think what has drawn people towards the more queer elements, as you said, the idea of outsider and stuff. We will return to that. I'm not dismissing it. I'm just sort of putting it aside for now because I think there's a lot to talk about from grief. You mentioned this idea of feeling outside and dismissed and stuff. And I think that there is a lot there. I think there's a lot there in regards to the idea that Amelia, the mother, hasn't, for want of a better phrase, gotten over the death of her husband. And I think her sister at one point in one of the parties is basically saying to her, like, you need to get help and deal with this. Essentially, your husband's been dead for years. Get over it. And it's quite as blunt as that.
Yeah, she says it in quite a problematic way, I think. And especially because within that party scene, the whole of the visual storytelling is set up to make Amelia as isolated as possible. A lot of the people around her they're kind of standing up straight. They're in very kind of unusual positions and everyone's very kind of straight backed. And Amelia is always below them.
I know, I agree. The way it's filmed is quite clever. There's a very kind of strict, structured, upright, powerful presence of the other people versus Amelia, who is portrayed pretty much throughout as very vulnerable. She is, in contrast to this kind of straight, upright. She's quite hunched. She sits on a chair and she kind of folds into herself a lot with her body language versus the way it's filmed. She's on one shot and then it'll flip around and it's almost like a panel of like interviews, like on one side of a table almost, and it's like the 4 or 5 people at the party just kind of like staring at her. As you mentioned,
heightened sense of isolation is hugely emphasized. I mean, it doesn't sound very subtle, but I think it is in the film quite subtle, actually, the way it's done. You kind of notice it and you're not really sure, but it heightens this sense of uncomfortableness. I just wanted to talk about grief. And it made me think of, and this is perhaps the queer theorist in me, it's a lengthy quote, but I am going to read it in full, from Judith Butler on grief, and it's from her book Undoing Gender. And I think it adds a lot to context, at least where I'm coming from, in regards to this. I think as well it will tie in quite well with some of the other themes that we're bringing up later on. Personally, I found this quote very reassuring when I lost someone relatively recently, and I found that kind of fantastically sort of way of thinking through grief. So I'll start reading now. I'm not sure I know when mourning is successful, or when one has fully mourned another human being. I'm certain, though, that it does not mean that one has forgotten the person, or that something else comes along to take his or her place. I don't think it works that way. I think instead that one mourns when one accepts the fact that the loss one undergoes will be one that changes you possibly forever, and that mourning has to do with agreeing to undergo a transformation, the full result of which you cannot know in advance. So there is losing, and there is the transformative effect of loss, and this latter cannot be charted or planned. I don't think, for instance, you can invoke a Protestant ethic when it comes to loss. You can't say, oh, I'll go through loss this way, and that will be the result, and I'll apply myself to the task, and I'll endeavour to achieve the resolution of grief that is before me. I think one is hit by waves, and that one starts out the day with an aim, a project, a plan, and one finds oneself foiled. One finds oneself fallen. One is exhausted but does not know why. Something is larger than one's own deliberate plan or project, larger than one's own knowing. Something takes hold, but is this something coming from the self, from the outside, or from some region where the difference between the two is indeterminable? What is it that claims us at such moments, such that we are not the masters of ourselves? To what are we tied? And by what are we seized? Let's face it, we're undone by each other. And if we're not, we're missing something. If this seems so clearly the case with grief, it is because it was already the case with desire. One does not always stay intact. Maybe that one wants to, or does, but it may also be that despite one's best efforts, one is undone in the face of the other, by the touch, by the scent, by the feel, by the prospect of touch, by the memory of the feel. So that's quite a lengthy quote, I'm aware, and one which I think gives a lot of context into kind of the undoing of the character of Amelia in the face of the loss of her husband. She clings to this, to use the language in that quote, to this memory of the feel, of the desire that she had for him. In the film, the basement of the house is essentially off limits, as it were, to Samuel the child, partially because it holds all of the belongings of her husband that she hasn't sorted through yet. They're all in boxes, and they're down there, and there's like a coat rack, for example, down there with his coats on that kind of resembles a figure of, well, him, I guess, or the Babadook as it comes later on. There's all, he was a musician, wasn't he, Jamie? So there's his music notes and his violin, I believe, are down there.
Yeah, he's a musician, and I think that lends itself to a lot of people see music as being very emotional, and the absence of music in her life because she's locked it all away, I think is another signifier of how she's dealing with her grief at that point. I think him being an artist and her locking away everything that he was, it also shows that she's avoiding that kind of expression and how to express how she's feeling. And Nick, I think you probably talk about how people express their grief in different ways, and about how not everyone necessarily has the same way of grieving.
I think that's right. I think the party scene actually emphasises this in the film, because very much the premise of the film, to build on the narrative that you sort of explained earlier, is that she just essentially hasn't, I'm using this as a quote and I'm aware of the problems necessarily behind it, but dealing with her own grief. And it kind of builds up behind the scenes, as it were. And that kind of manifests itself in the form of the Babadook, which is why people read the Babadook as this metaphor for grief. And it kind of comes back and haunts her, like obviously quite literally in the film, and plays on her mind a lot. There's a lot of questions raised about how real the Babadook actually is. Is it an actual physical manifestation of whatever her grief as a monster, or is it all in her head? There's a lot of ideas throughout that kind of suggest that she might be sort of losing her grip on reality, or maybe having some sort of psychotic break that causes some of the horror
in the film, and she definitely flits between being in control and just absolutely losing any semblance of control. I think this brings us quite nicely to this idea of pushing things aside. So I'm going to kind of take what seems like a bit of a harsh break, but hopefully it will link up later. Why do people look at the Babadook as a queer icon? Where has this come from? Because this isn't a film that necessarily immediately leaps out as fun and fabulous and queer and exciting and people claiming ownership of this monster, as it were. So what on earth is the story behind all of that?
So I think that the whole claiming of the Babadook as a queer icon, I think, came from it can be traced back to October 2016 on Tumblr, when an user named Instagram, which is a great name by the way, posted a thought complaint.
Thought complaint?
A thought complaint.
What is that?
I have no idea. I copied this from somewhere.
Okay, a thought complaint.
To be fair, that is just thinking, isn't it? Let's be honest. Yeah, so he posted a thought complaint and it said, whenever someone says the Babadook isn't openly gay, it's like, do you even watch the movie? So that was kind of where it started from, and it kind of bubbled up on Tumblr and was getting reposted quite a lot. And then a couple of months later, Ryan Broderick, who is part of BuzzFeed, posted a kind of mocking appraisal of Tumblr's Babadiscourse, which it was now known, on Twitter. So he very much kind of went and said, how is this a thing? But then Instagram defended his reading and posted on Twitter, a movie about a gay man who just wants to live his life in a small Australian suburb. It may be just a movie to you, but to the LGBT community, the Babadook is a symbol of our journey. So I think that kind of encapsulates the thought process behind having the Babadook as a queer icon. And I think from that moment on, the internet really ran with it, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then we started seeing physical manifestations of the Babadook at Pride events, and it kind of took over. And I think for me, that's pretty amazing. When I first watched the movie, obviously I came in with the knowledge of this whole thing about the Babadook, but I watched the movie and then I sat there for a few minutes and was thinking, the themes that I have, the way that I've read into this movie doesn't necessarily jump out at me as LGBT, but I think after looking at the movie closer, I think there's definitely subtext there which can allow you to have this read. And I think this is what I love about the internet and how community works, because it's just, I think it's more about the community kind of coming together and rallying around this one character and kind of taking ownership of it. And I really like that. What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very queer thing anyway. The queer community generally, I think, tends to find characters or icons and latch onto them. Judy Garland, for example. I can't believe I just put Judy Garland and the Babadook in like comparison here. I'm going to get lynched. There's going to be a queer lynch mob outside my flat soon, demanding that I hand in my gay card. But I think we tend to find icons that are subversive, and paradoxically, icons that can be threatening to some and not threatening to others, which is where I think the Babadook actually comes in. There's a lot of, for example, campness with villainy. I know we touched on this earlier on our previous podcast together. This idea of ownership of things that broad society may view as undesirable. So playing with gender fuckery, campness, general fabulousness, I think, is a kind of thing. Because I think when we were discussing this before, I think you described the Babadook as, I've got a quote here. I think that the Babadook is just kind of extra, generally. And in your face, and you describe them as the friend that goes too far at Christmas and makes you something. And you're like, how do I respond to this? He just kind of takes it and runs with it. And I think there's an irony that the queer community often, particularly online, have and run with. But for me, I think there's some really interesting conversation that can take place. Is this idea and this feeling of Amelia sort of pushing aside and refusing to engage with the reality
of her situation and the reality of the fact that she's not in a great situation. She's a single mother. Her husband died in a traumatic way. Her son has various emotional problems that she's trying to deal with. And I think she tries to deal with them as any mother would, I think. I don't think there's any problematic way in terms of her trying to find a way to deal with this quite human emotion. But I think what speaks to a lot of people is if this Babadook creature comes to represent that which is ignored and it gradually grows in power as it's ignored, I think that's where the queer community latches on, because a lot of queer people feel ignored, particularly within their own families. And as the Babadook grows in power in the film, as it's being more and more ignored, if you look at the Babadook as also a representation, I think this is where the queer reading really comes in, representation of queerness here. The idea that there can be power in being ignored, or power, you can gain power from being ignored, because actually the reality of the film is the Babadook can't be ignored. You can ignore it all you want, but it's just going to get more and more powerful until it's very much in your face. And it quite literally gets in her face a couple of times towards the climax of the movie. It kind of swoops in and you see it from this sort of first person perspective on the camera of it getting right up to her and how she kind of like has to sort of like deal with this thing that's being thrown at her. So for a young queer person, you can ignore this all you want, but it's going to come back and get you. You can't just pretend I don't exist, because it's going to get shoved in your face. I think that's where power comes from. It's the premise of the Pride festivals. We're here, we're queer, get used to it, being that famous slogan that comes up at them a lot. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Jamie?
Yeah, I really love that reading. I am totally on board with that reading as well. And I think that a lot of what you said definitely rings true for a lot of people. And I think towards the end of the film as well, you see that once Amelia has accepted the Babadook as part of her life, then she becomes a lot happier and she starts expressing more and starts to really integrate with society. So I think that that's a really positive message. And I will say, like, he does have a really great top hat, and I'm like, he kind of like, he runs with it, you know. And I think and also like kind of, yeah, and he has his like gloves and yeah. And I don't think this is necessarily something that the filmmaker was thinking of, but at one point the Babadook is trapped in the closet, so you know
he comes out and the kid screams and the closet doors are open. Ah!
So I mean that is also something that you can definitely read into. I do really like the fact that for a lot of especially younger queer people, they can feel outcast and they can feel different, and the fact that to a general audience the Babadook is this thing that's to be feared, but actually once it's embraced becomes a strong part of someone's life. I think that's a great analogy. And I think, yeah, I just really love how this has become a thing.
That's really interesting, because I'm not sure of how much I agree with you with that. I'll be honest with you. So I agree there's this sort of sense of power, and I also agree that once she's kind of faces the Babadook, she is, I think, happier and expressive. I agree with all of that. My sticking point, for want of a better phrase, is the fact that, yes, all of this takes place, but the Babadook is still just in the basement. So at the end of the film, the Babadook doesn't get to go out and be expressive. The Babadook doesn't get to go out and be happy. Actually locked in the basement at the end, and she has to go down and sort of deal with it. But if the Babadook is coming to represent queerness, it suggests that the Babadook is only tolerable on heteronormative society's way of doing it. The Babadook isn't able to sort of run around society being fabulous and queer and whatever.
And I think that's where the analogy starts to break down a little bit. I think that's where you start to see that this reading is very much, it's not what the filmmaker was intending.
No, yeah. I see what you mean. I think you're right. And to say where I'm coming from, I don't necessarily read automatically this queer reading. I think you said that earlier. I think the queer reading is really interesting, and it's like, I think, productive conversations that can come from it, but I don't think it is a natural reading from the text. It's not a one-to-one
a one-to-one parallel. There's no, if you do take it as a one-to-one parallel, I think that then things become problematic, like having the Babadook in the basement and things like that. I think you kind of have to pick and choose what elements you take from this film.
Yeah, but I think queer theory does a lot of that anyway. I think a lot of theory does that anyway, I'll be honest with you. But I think there's something really interesting about the idea of the Babadook as both sort of this, if we're reading it in this way, this sort of double-edged idea of grief and queerness. First of all, the fact that grief and queerness in this reading are parallels. The idea that queerness is something to grieve about, to use Butler's words, to be undone by. I like the idea of the Babadook as a threat to the family. He is both formed by the fracturing of the family unit. So the idea that the Babadook is the grief of the lost husband here, so the death of the husband is what causes it. And that death of the husband sort of destroys any reproductive future of that specific family. In fact, it's going to the hospital to give birth to Samuel that he dies, which I think is really important there. There's a lack of progeny moving forward of the family unit, much like the idea of queerness coming in there. And this makes me think of Lee Edelman in No Future. I think I mentioned this briefly as well at the end of the last podcast that we did together. But he comes up with this term called the syntomosexual, and it's a blending of homosexual and the French word symptôme. Excuse my god-awful French accent, which is symptom, is what it means. So in No Future, the syntomosexual comes to represent that negating force, which has no interest in, but also actively undermines the social structure of the family moving forward. The Babadook does this because obviously it's the loss of the family, but because of this lack of, the term that Edelman uses is reproductive futurism, it's inherently a threat to society overall and society of the family unit, and a threat specifically to the child as a figure. And in the film, I think there's a lot of idea playing through is the child threatened? How is the child affected by the Babadook? Because it comes to haunt the child first and then sort of spreads out to Amelia throughout. They read the book together, but the child's the one who's going, the Babadook is in the closet, for example. He actually uses in No Future the film The Birds, and the birds themselves in that come to represent the threat to the child. They attack the mothers, they attack the school children, they attack and kill the parents and so on. So that's kind of like how he uses it. And I think we're doing a similar thing here. Like The Birds is not about queerness. It's about birds attacking. It's a classic Hitchcock horror. And I think we're doing something similar with the Babadook here. So if this Babadook becomes to represent this sort of queer threat to heteronormative structures of society, and it's a manifestation of queerness, so it's literally a queer body in this sense, and it comes to attack this family unit, I think again this is this idea of threat and kind of relief. I think for a lot of queer people, and of course I cannot ever claim to speak on behalf of all queer people, I'm not trying to say that here at the minute, the traditional family unit isn't one which they often feel they fit in to. There's a sense of kinship built from other, like a found family, as it were. And I know a lot of found family dramas, as it were, often have a queer following because queer viewers often feel like they have been rejected by their family. And you can find a family that accepts you as one is, I should say. What are your thoughts on that, Jamie?
I definitely agree with that reading. And I think it's great that the queer community, and obviously, again, disclosure, we can't talk on the whole of the queer community, but I think it's great that the queer community can relate to certain aspects within media that isn't necessarily explicitly about the queer experience. Yeah, I think this is inherently a problem, though, that there isn't explicit queer themes within media very much. I think that, yes, it's good that the queer community can take these ideas from the media that they're given, but I think eventually it comes to a point where we need more stories and more diverse stories to be told, so that the queer community doesn't have to read into films past what the filmmaker's intent was.
So instead you're saying, just so I understand, we're lacking the stories of queer representation in this. So people are taking the Babadook and making that a queer representation because there's nowhere else to get it from.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is both, it's a double-edged sword. It is a positive, and it's great that the Babadook can have this life past what it was intended to be. But at the same time, I personally, I want to see more queer stories that are explicitly about it. And I think, but then that kind of goes into what you're talking about, in that a lot of the queer community feel like they don't belong within the heteronormative norms. Heteronormative norms is probably the same thing.
No, I understand what you're saying. I think as well, it's not just that, it's the idea that queerness is only accepted on heteronormative's own terms.
Yes, yeah.
There's
exactly.
which is why Pride festivals, I think, still get a lot of issue. And that's part of the issue of the commercialization that people bring into Pride festivals. And a lot of people not liking that because it's a Pride festival on the terms of, say, a big bank that's funding it or whatever. Then they control what does and doesn't take place there. So I think there's a conversation to take place there. And I mean, we'd be kidding ourselves if we didn't say things like Disney and DreamWorks and Fox and all of this aren't primarily heteronormative. Like, of course they are. Just look at the backlash any sort of representation of LGBT or queerness gets anyway. Whereas because this isn't explicit in the Babadook, yeah, it's got a sort of an undercurrent that you can sort of play with. But I kind of want to touch on this idea of tolerance. I think there's a really interesting idea of tolerance that comes up here. And I'm looking at a book on tolerance here, and I'm thinking of The Argument on Tolerance by Wendy Brown, who is, and I'm just going to get the exact reference now, Regulating Aversion, it's called, and Tolerance in the Age of Identity and Empire. And Wendy Brown, by chance, is partners with Judith Butler, so it's like a little power couple I love. But to slightly simplify it, she does this far better than I could ever sort of elaborate on. But she argues that tolerance in and of itself isn't a positive thing. And by that, she means that tolerance is predicated on a power imbalance. It's not acceptance as an equal. Tolerance is the idea that one group with power is going to a group with lesser power. I accept the difficulties that you are bringing here. And then it's not an acceptance, really, is it? If you're saying it in that way, what you're saying is, you are worse than me, but I'm a good enough person to let that slide, to put up with it, as it were, rather than accept you on the terms that you bring. That power imbalance in and of itself makes tolerance in that act quite a difficult emotion to negotiate. It renders an act of toleration to always be a power dynamic. Tolerance is always quite ridden with a sense of conflict and of aggressiveness, even if it's quite subtle, because it is constantly the act of one person going, I'm putting you down. Even if two sides tolerate the other, there is still inherent within that idea of I am tolerating you, the sense that we're right, you're wrong, and I'm a good enough person to deal with that. So when we're talking about the Babadook in this, the idea for me of this Babadook being in the basement, and we're looking at these parallels here, if we're looking at it from grief, it's the idea that actually grief will never fully leave you. What you learn to do is to tolerate grief, and you learn to accept grief, and you deal with it with your own terms. That's fine when it comes to grief, I think, if your own personal sense of grief. She goes down into the basement, she sort of deals with the Babadook, she kind of then puts it away again, she compartmentalizes, and then she can live the rest of her life. She can express, as you said. When that comes to queerness and the sense of someone's sense of being, that, as you said, it kind of runs past the analogy of the original, and it becomes so problematic because it's the idea of I'm tolerating you, and she literally feeds this thing worms. Like, she kind of it lives like some sort of othered creature, and instead of a closet, it's a basement. I mean, I think you can draw that parallel there. So much as I again love this idea of the Babadook as a queer figure, as you said, it's deeply problematic.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a problematic thing. And when you first brought my attention to the tolerance thing, it kind of blew my mind. And it like framing tolerance in that way definitely makes you think about how you are affecting people around you. Yeah, I think for me, the whole thing about the other and the basement and things like that, it's definitely problematic. But then I wholeheartedly support the people who have gone out and reclaimed this monster in quotation marks, because and also I think the fact of the matter is that we don't see much of the Babadook in the whole of the film. So I think that also lends itself because we don't see it doing horrific things.
It's like the idea that I like that, the idea that it's always referenced, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. It's never explicit, or it's only explicit for a very short amount of screen time.
And that screen time, when it is quite a violent sort of, or it's like the climax of the film, isn't it? It's the height of the tension. But no, I think that's really interesting because I feel like it's almost like the conservative family sort of just referencing, you know, like the queer aunt, like, oh no, we don't talk about her kind of thing. And then she comes along with her girlfriend at like a family dinner and everyone's really tense about it. And it's kind of, you know, that's a weirdly specific story I've constructed in my mind that genuinely has no basis in my own reality here. But I don't know where it came from. But no, I love that idea of this kind of reference. Just as you were speaking there, I was just thinking, and I'm kind of thinking as I go here, and I'd love your thoughts on this. The idea of the queer community taking the Babadook and running with that. Is that the freeing of the Babadook from the basement? Is that the queer community going, we're not staying in the basement. We are running with it. And we are taking the Babadook out into pride parades and going, you are free, little Babadook. You can be your little queer cryptid self and do your thing. What do you think of that?
I really, really, really like that reading. I think that is, out of everything that we've discussed, that's a very positive way of looking at the film and the ending of the film, and like being able to free this thing that someone is restricting, you know. So that also links into Jennifer Kent, the director and writer. And she said she loved the memes, and she said, and this is a quote from her, I think it's crazy, and the meme just kept him alive. I thought, you bastard. He doesn't want to die, so he's finding ways to become relevant. And I think maybe that relevancy is actually more about how the Babadook has been freed from the stigma that the film puts on it.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that as a kind of, I feel like everyone else has read that and we're like, oh, we're just coming to this. And everyone else is like, yeah, we know. So for all of you who are like that, apologies. You've probably figured out that this has been a relatively unstructured conversation. So we are kind of thinking as we go on this and having this conversation. I wanted to bring back this idea of the Babadook to the way it's filmed at the end. She goes down into this basement, as it were, and she is sort of feeding this Babadook, tolerating this Babadook. And there's a brief moment, and you see it through the Babadook's eyes, actually. You see it through like a first-person camera shot of the Babadook almost overwhelming Amelia, and she kind of has to fight back, and she's like, whoa, stop. And you'll see it nearly knocks her off her feet, and she kind of struggles back up. It's almost Matrix-esque in how she leans, isn't it? And I think that hints at this idea, this fear of being overwhelmed by the other, and in this case it's grief. And I think this goes back to the way that, to use the Judith Butler quote, I think one is hit by waves, and one starts out the day with an aim, a project, a plan, and one finds oneself foiled. If we're reading this in a queer way, though, is hinting at a fear that the queer, and I use the queer as a sort of a subject and an object in and of itself. Is there a fear of the queer overwhelming normative society there, and the fact that you have to sort of fight back against this feeling of being overwhelmed specifically? And I think it kind of plays to this idea that you always hear with particularly political and legal discourse around LGBT. You're like, oh, if we allow gay marriage, what's next? We're going to be marrying dogs. You know, absolutely ludicrous conversations that people try and make it about. Do you feel that that's something that's being hinted at here? How do you feel that that fear of being overwhelmed plays in with this idea of the Babadook being freed in society? Just what are your thoughts on those two, I guess, as parallels?
Yeah, I think that this idea of something to be overcome. Yeah, so I think there's definitely this thing of the eye of the beholder, and how there's a difference between a monster and being monstrous. And I think at the end of the film, the Babadook tries to take over Amelia and she has to battle against it. That's her dealing with it. But I think the fact that the queer community has taken the Babadook and they've kind of almost lent into the idea of and accepted this quote unquote unquote monster, and now it's become something more. It's become something that is empowering. It's become something that isn't meant to be hid away.
Yeah, I like that this tension, and I think this is a tension that exists permanently anyway in the queer community. Like I said earlier, this is why pride marches exist. If it was acceptance and not tolerance, we didn't have it. It makes me think actually of a couple of things to sort of draw on. You mentioned the idea of monsters are not monstrous. I agree. Like, look at Monsters Inc. It's the premise of actually one can be a monster, and they start off trying to be monstrous and scare the kids, and they realize actually they don't need to be monstrous even though they are monsters. So this idea of monstrous has been completely reclaimed in the past, particularly by feminist works. So there is I don't believe they're going anymore, but there's a famous feminist theatre group called Monstrous Regiment, which some of you may recognise as the title of a Terry Pratchett book. But that title comes from the same where Monstrous Regiment, this theatre group, came from. And it was an attack. The original book was called The First Blast of the Trumpet Against this Monstrous Regiment of Women. And it was the idea that women shouldn't be monarchs because it's contrary to the Bible. Therefore, it is monstrous. Now, I think a lot of people nowadays would be like, excuse me, like, not how that is. And this feminist theatre group reclaimed this monstrous regiment as a kind of, fine, we are a monstrous regiment then, and we're going to run with it, which I love. And I think Terry Pratchett is playing off this idea as well in his text, as I believe it's like an all-female group, like militia, basically. So there's this idea of monstrous versus not, and reclamation that comes in anyway with the queer community. So I'm going to wrap up. I did want to draw on this final quote. I'm just going to read just a little bit of a small article from Michael Bronsky, who is a professor of women and gender studies at Harvard, who talks about this idea of queerness and this double-edgedness that you mentioned earlier, Jamie. So they say in the article, at the very first official gay pride parade in New York City in 1970, activist Donna Gottschalk, apologies for the pronunciation, held up a sign, "I am your worst fear, I am your best fantasy." In looking at this sign, Bronsky says, in some way, gay people, queer people, are the worst fear for heterosexuals, as well as on some level, the best fantasy. The sheer pleasure of not being on the inside, of not having to control everything you do and think and say to fit to norms. And Bronsky says the sign embraces the Babadook, which kind of represents this sort of queer affiliation to monsters, which is what we mentioned earlier. And for people who lived a lot of their love and their passion in the closet, who felt demonized in the broader culture, it's very easy to find points of identifications with monsters. So embracing this literal demon can feel like a way of reclaiming power and agency. And he says, quite fantastically, in this moment, who better than the Babadook to represent not only queer desire, but queer antagonism, queer in-your-faceness, queerness. And I think that's a nice way to end it. I think we've covered a lot there, and I think if we carried on, we'd risk repeating ourselves a lot. That I'm kind of loath to do. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, Jamie, for coming. Do you have anything you want to plug? Anything you want to reference, social media, any projects you're involved in?
Thank you so much for having me. You can find me on Twitter at Jamie Sarge. That's Serge.
Fine. Yeah, thank you. So we will be back for a discussion for people who have listened to the podcast and want to sort of have maybe a half-hour discussion afterwards. But details of that will be forthcoming, and we'll be publicising that as soon as we know. It will probably be online, maybe on Facebook. Not sure yet, but like I said, keep an eye on the website. Again, that's queerdisrupt.com. And yes, all I would do is encourage listeners, if you have any thoughts, to get in contact with us. There should be contact forms on there for us to talk about, engage with. If you would like to get involved and do a podcast yourself, by all means, let us know. The contact form on the website, that comes literally to me. So you'll be talking to me directly. And yes, I think that covers everything. Thank you everyone for listening. Please go back, like, subscribe, and the rest of it. That does help a lot. I feel like I've turned into one of those YouTubers for like, subscribe, and comment. So we'll say goodbye. So goodbye from me, and goodbye.